Jeffrey Epstein was a front for an intelligence operation, maybe one intelligence service, maybe multiple intelligence services, probably the latter. Epstein isn't just a list of priorities. Knowing the degree to which we do not live in a democratic republic and are being governed by dark forces is a different kind of priority.
Recently, Bret Weinstein went on the Dad Saves America podcast to talk about the truth regarding Epstein, his intelligence connections, the Epstein Files, and the reason for the Trump administration's cover-up. This is in the context of a conversation with John Papola. He runs Dad Saves America podcast. Excellent podcast. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Well, let's take the Epstein situation.
Yeah.
It was a funny thing to promise us transparency on that issue, to make indications that we were headed down that road, that we were going to see something important. And then a sudden about-face in which the administration swears across the board that there actually is nothing to see and that we should be happy with the other accomplishments of the administration because aren't they wonderful? Something happened behind the scenes. Either they discovered something about what they had that caused them not to want to release it, or some leverage was revealed that caused them to realize they couldn't afford to release it. But I guess the point is, if they had said nothing and done nothing, I wouldn't necessarily infer something important. But having said, we're giving you this, and then making the embarrassing reversal of course suggests there's simply an element of this plot that we don't know anything about.
It's a very strange story on a lot of fronts because it's an old story. I talked about this in a recent video that I think the first big piece on Jeffrey Epstein was in the New Yorker in like 2002. And it laid out the story of him as this international man of mystery. And there was a cartoon character version of him and Bill Clinton, chummy, with Chris Carter and the actor whose name is escaping me from Usual Suspects, who got into a lot of trouble for pestery. It'll come back.
Kevin Spacey.
Kevin Spacey.
Yeah, that helps the case a lot, right? Associations with Kevin Spacey after everything that happened with him. But yeah, I mean, obviously leverage was discovered here, and all signs point to nefarious influences behind the scenes connected to Epstein, whether you go full bore into the child sex trafficking operation on behalf of Mossad, or just prominent people engaging in illicit activities with cultivated experiences by this madman. You know, just the vile atrocities and crimes committed against these girls in the process. And Bret is right. If the administration actually would have said nothing from the jump, I don't think people would be as suspicious as they are. But this was promised in multitudes on the campaign trail, that Trump is going to bring transparency to this case, release the Epstein Files, when the Biden administration wouldn't do that. Pam Bondi and Dan Bongino and Kash Patel talked about that endlessly, and they were elevated by Trump to positions of prominence, and they haven't done that.
And this is the article where, you know, Trump is sort of says, oh yeah, Jeff and I are good friends, and he likes girls as much as I do, you know, and he likes them young, and even saying that in public is weird in 2002. But you're a playboy in New York, I guess. I don't know, but it just keeps on going and keeps getting weirder. So how do you understand what you know about this story? And why do you care?
Why do I care is the easiest question in the world, which is what we do seem to know about the story implies a sophisticated operation to collect compromise. There's some debate as to whether or not he was a freelancer arranging compromise for his own reasons, or whether he worked for somebody. I think it's a slam dunk that he must have worked for somebody. But the point is this. The fact of the crimes committed by Epstein and the people that he was involved with is profound in its own right.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you put that aside, the important question for us is, what role is the Epstein Library playing in our governance of our own civilization?
Yeah.
Our civilization, to the extent that it is a departure from history, is based on the consent of the governed, which means that we govern ourselves.
Yeah, that's just propaganda at this point, I would say. We don't, defer our powers to government and then government represents us at all because we don't give them the power to murder. We can't murder on our own. So when government murders, it perverts that understanding that government is derived from the consent of the governed. It's a great idealistic attitude, mindset. That's what Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, but that's not how we're governed. But I do agree that the entire Epstein case is emblematic of the dark underbelly under the state, protecting people in prominence, ensuring the fact that the law doesn't apply to all, especially criminal law against vile offenders, against offenders of the lowest and most disgusting crimes in the world, like sex trafficking and sexual molestation. There were over 40 witnesses in Epstein's first case where he got that sweetheart deal from Alex Acosta. So this is not just some reprehensible criminal. This is a reprehensible criminal with close ties to the biggest people in prominence in the United States, and the administration's still covering this up.
But if something has gotten leverage over important people sufficient to cause things that we want not to happen and to cause things we don't want to happen, then we are not self-governed. And we need to know, it is a top priority for us to discover whether or not the amount of steering that is being done with that material is major, which I suspect it is, or it's minor and it is, and the world is roughly as we imagine it should be. So I don't see higher priorities than understanding to what extent the democratic nature of our society is a fiction.
Yeah, exactly. And the two-tiered system in which we live under this elite regime that can get away with crimes like this, and their associations never embroil others in their fate. And just the duplicity involved in this from both administrations, the Biden administration and the Trump administration, is such that this story will linger forever. This is going to be our generation's JFK, a story we endlessly speculate about forever. We know that there's some deep, dark secret that the state is hiding, but we may never get to the bottom of it. And I just hope people lose trust in this whole tyrannical system along the way, I guess. I would like answers. That would be my top priority, not only for the victims of these heinous crimes, but to shed light on Epstein's potential intelligence connections and connections that would be particularly embarrassing to reveal. I think that is the biggest fear of this administration in continuing to cover this up. But that's what I think.
The Epstein Library, for example, was deliberately collected to shape world events, is perfectly consistent with the idea that an administration that was promising to release this material would be opposed at the highest possible strength on its way towards attaining the office, and that upon reaching the office, that there would be a strange turnabout in which the materials would not emerge. So I guess the point is there is hidden leverage, and those who have it will do anything to prevent its loss. And that means that things will get strange. You will see a kind of distortion.
Yeah, like this was a Democratic hoax, or the idea that Trump was an FBI informant, or the idea that Supermax facility erases 1 minute of footage every night when it was actually 3 minutes, by the way, or that this piles of videos that Pam Bondi was said to have was initially Jeffrey Epstein molesting children, and then it just became child porn. Or the Epstein client list was on my desk, but no, I was just kidding about that. It was actually the case in general, not the client list. All these weird things are indicative of trying to throw the American people off the trail of this, to take our scent off of this, and there's no higher priority than to look into this based on how this administration has treated this story, surely.
Around some massive object that you can't detect, but it will cause things to warp. And that's exactly what we see every time in the Epstein case.
Yeah, I mean, one element of what has happened with this that is really strange is, I mean, it's historically strange to have this gap between presidencies, right? To have Donald Trump come into office in 2016, and all the facts of his understanding, knowledge, experience with Jeffrey Epstein are already known and haven't changed since. To then, for him to come out of office, to be prosecuted and persecuted with what looks like every tool his opponents have at their disposal, I guess save for this one, which is weird. If there is a tool against him that they could have used, why wouldn't they have? And then for him to come back into office, having already been in the presidency, and on the way in making promises about this material, which in the prior period, he technically, I guess, should have had enough power to know what was there. And now we're back and there's this turnaround. And that sequence is really weird because it's like, well, why didn't the Democrats use it against him for the past 4 years? Why would he and his surrogates make promises about releasing it, given that he should have known what's in here?
Well, that one is actually pretty easy to me if the scenario is as I suspect, and that's that the Democrats are implicated in the same material that would implicate Trump or people close to Trump. This is how they would behave, that both parties in the uni-party, as we call it, the massive Venn diagram crossover between the two parties, if both sides of that uni-party were implicated, neither side would release it. Because even if one side wanted to release it and try to aim it toward their political opponents, they'd have to include all sorts of redactions and things like that, which would just cause more suspicions about their nefarious cover-up. So this would be how they are behaving if they're all implicated, if all sides of this thing. I'm not talking about every single bureaucrat or every single president. And besides that, it's also explainable by, the fact that our governmental system isn't just surface level where it's just the two parties vying against each other. It's a criminal underbelly in the form of the deep state and the legal community tied to that deep state, and the military-industrial complex and big pharma and big banks tied into that deep state that don't necessarily wear the flag or the banner or the pin of a particular party, but are probably involved in this story too. If you want to cover up for what they're doing, you can't release the material against your political opponents either.
In the prior period, if they knew they couldn't do that. So flesh that out for me, because this is the part of this that is really kind of crazy, actually.
I think this part's easy, actually.
Oh, okay.
Let's imagine that the cartoon view of what's taken place is roughly right, just broad brush. That Jeffrey Epstein was a front for an intelligence operation, maybe one intelligence service, maybe multiple intelligence services, probably the latter. But whatever, there's some...
I don't think that's the cartoon version, actually. I think that's the Occam's razor being applied. I think that's the most plausible scenario based on everything we've seen, all of Epstein's connections that are known and documented, very thoroughly throughout time, his connections to intelligence figures, being the protege of Robert Maxwell, being connected with Ari Ben-Menashe, who said that Epstein told him he was engaging in blackmail and was a Mossad asset. His closeness to figures like Douglas Leese and Adnan Khashoggi, who did arms trafficking for the CIA under the Iran-Contra that Epstein was very closely associated with. Adnan Khashoggi was one of his clients, supposedly. His closeness to Ehud Barak, former IDF intelligence and prime minister that stayed at his home for a prolonged period of time. Yeah, there's too many connections here for that to be the cartoon version of the story, actually. And all the people he was gaining leverage over by placing them in compromising positions with these girls and sexually exploiting them. It just becomes plausible and not the cartoon version, if you're asking me.
Hidden entity that enjoys a permanent advantage in terms of information, and that it went about collecting specifically useful information through Jeffrey Epstein, his connections, and his ability to parasitize the worst aspects of human character, etc. Okay, so you've got a pile of leverage points. First of all, you would want to use them as sparsely as you could. You don't want to define the leverage that you hold, because somebody who is playing against you, who understands exactly what you hold, has a useful piece of information in its own right. So you would want to use it sparingly. In each case, you would never want to get to the bottom of the barrel where you've thrown everything at somebody that you wish to leverage and you have nothing left, because at that point, the incentives of the person who you've gone after with this piece of leverage has nothing left to lose, and they turn on you. So you would imagine that there would be a kind of a hierarchy of leverage, and that especially with a character like Trump. And I'm not saying that there are things about Trump himself in the Epstein library. I, of course, have no idea.
Well, we know that his name is in the files. That's not really surprising, and that's something it seems like he's been defensive about. But we know that the FBI told him that his name's in the files. It wouldn't be a surprise, though. He was a longtime friend of Epstein until about 2004. It seems like a schism developed between the two, and he was the sitting U.S. president at the time that the investigation was proceeding. And even Epstein's lawyers say that Trump was, cooperative in the initial investigation regarding Epstein. So it's not a mystery that would be the case, but it's also not indicative of, a declaration of whether or not he was involved in Epstein's nefarious crimes or not. I'm open to that idea, but we can't know that just because of his name being in the library or the files.
They obviously had contact. Maybe, let's just say, I'm not arguing that Trump is in there in the way that we fear others are, but
like Prince Andrew, for example.
Right, like Prince Andrew, for example. But if you had a character like Trump who had proven that he was capable of leaping levels of the game and changing roles radically and defying expectations, the last thing you want to do is take whatever leverage you have and throw it all at him and hope it works. Because if it fails, now you've basically injured the grizzly bear and you don't have any ammo left.
Yeah, they basically did that with Russiagate, said he was essentially a Putin stooge operating under the guise of Russia in the federal government. The whole thing was a farce. They threw that at him for 2 to 3 years. America was captivated by that. And it ultimately failed. He still became president, escaped all the absurd charges against him. But it didn't really fail in the sense that no one in the FBI or the intelligence community went down for that. So I'm with Bret. That makes sense. They wouldn't necessarily throw it out there if they don't think, it will stick or they don't have something substantial. But again, if they're implicated too, they're not going to be forthcoming about information that implicates the whole Washington political scene.
And you maybe exposed your tool set, right? That's the other piece, is that in doing that, you've now invited the game to be fully revealed.
Absolutely. So what you would do is you would have a kind of, this is the, break glass in case of emergency piece of leverage that we are going to hold back if the worst comes at us. What would the worst be? Oh, that the president himself is interested in revealing the leverage war chest, and that would be, I mean, just put yourself in the position of its owners. That would be apocalyptic. So you would have something, and whether that is a threat, a credible threat, or it is a revelation of compromise on people that Trump can't afford to lose or is emotionally connected to in a way that he would fall on his sword to protect them. Who knows what it might be? But let's just say an intelligence service which would have a virtually unlimited budget to create leverage would know a great deal about what would work to persuade Trump. They would have invested heavily in analyzing him, what wouldn't work, and the about face, Pam Bondi telling us it was on her desk and she was ready to go, and then Dan Bongino and Kash Patel telling us, hey, it all is on the up and up. We've looked at the file. He killed himself.
And that's so farcical and absurd. Americans laugh at that mentality, especially from people that floated the idea that he didn't kill himself, in fact, and are now saying that once they get on the inside. And look, a lot of people think that there's blackmail against Trump from, say, Israel or something like that. And on the surface, I can understand that view. Trump does, basically cultivate an Israel first mentality in this administration, not only in foreign policy, but in domestic policy, targeting people for deportation that are critics of Israel, trying to alter hate speech laws and hate speech codes and encourage that in the states such that it conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, starting a war in Iran for the sake of Netanyahu, shredding the JCPOA in his first term for the sake of Netanyahu, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem for the sake of Netanyahu and preventing a two-state solution, signing the Abraham Accords for the sake of Netanyahu, bankrolling a genocide in Gaza for the sake of Netanyahu over and over and over again. But he wouldn't really have to be blackmailed potentially to do that. He's long been a supporter of Israel. He boasts about how close he is toward Israel. So I don't know if that's the leverage point, even though he certainly is influenced or controlled by Israel. It seems like Netanyahu has more influence over the United States than the United States, who's bankrolling Netanyahu, has over Israel, per se. But it might just be an affinity and the AIPAC and Israel lobby's influence over the president like they have with congressmen.
That was such a strange episode. I think the most parsimonious interpretation is that there was chaos in the administration as they grappled with the fact that something that they had planned to do was no longer going to be done. And I also thought the president's tweet was profoundly revealing.
Which one is this?
So maybe it wasn't a tweet, maybe it was Truth Social, and I saw it on Twitter. But he said effectively exactly what you would imagine that the man we've come to know would say, which was, Epstein's dead. Get over it. It's in the past. There's nothing you're going to get here, but look at all the other marvelous things that you have gotten and are going to get, and would you really want to put that in jeopardy? In other words, he tried to negotiate with us, not understanding that Epstein isn't just a list of priorities. Like I said a few minutes ago, knowing the degree to which we do not live in a democratic republic and are being governed by dark forces that collect compromise and, cause us not to be able to govern ourselves is a different kind of priority, right? It's not a alteration in our tax rate.
Man, amen. If that isn't the truth, if it doesn't behoove us more to put eyes on Epstein after looking about how this administration has handled this story, I don't know what would persuade Americans to do that. This is the hill. This is the story we need to keep talking about, just because of how this administration has tried to steer our eyes away from it, divert from it, deflect to it, publicizing a lot of the Russiagate documents, which there were some new things in those docs, but still not indicting or charging any of the criminals involved in that, like Brennan or Comey or Clapper. They're not even trying to do that. but they are trying to deflect from this story, and that is very revealing. I'm with Bret on that last point. The fact that Trump responded to this in the manner that he did, nothing to see here, I can't believe you're asking about Epstein, Epstein's dead, and then going to this is a Democratic hoax, and then you're not my true supporter if you still want to get to the bottom of this child sex trafficking ring that involves some of the most prominent and powerful people in the world. Yeah, that whole facade, that is the angle he went with. And, you know, they've behaved in a way where it's impossible not to want to pay more attention to this. And you can see why a lot of people are peeling off Trump and their support for Trump over this story based on how they behaved. This is not satisfying the expectations of people that may have voted for Trump, supported him, you know, slightly, held their nose and voted for him because they thought he was so much better than Harris. Not just for the Epstein story, but the Epstein story is emblematic of this notion that Trump was going to come in and drain the swamp, which they don't even use that slogan anymore, I've noticed, because it's kind of become a meme. Same with America First. A lot of the time, it's just become a meme because clearly this is an Israel First administration or a Ukraine First administration. Totally so. But that's where we're at. I thought this conversation was great. I think there's a simple explanation as to why, you know, the Democrats wouldn't reveal this if Trump was implicated, and that's because they're all implicated. Both sides of this thing, and possibly bureaucrats that don't, you know, wear the pin of one particular party, although many of them clearly do, right? But that's where we're at. Let me know down below, do you agree with Bret Weinstein on this? What kind of leverage is there? Was Epstein a Mossad asset? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Dad Saves America too. I have the highest amount of respect for John and his podcast. I think it's one of the best in the world and criminally underviewed. I mean, he has a big channel, but there should be even more eyes on this podcast. John does a great job. I met him recently. He's kind of become a friend, and I really recommend you subscribe to him too. He's great. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can get access to all of my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.